You've got the skills, right? That doesn't mean you're going to execute them perfectly. No one knows the future. No one knows what's going to happen. But it does mean that you have the skill set required. And that's really all that we can ask ourselves, isn't it? Isn't that all that we can ask of ourselves, to show up, to know that we have the skill set, the capacity to execute those skills? Whether we do or not, well, that's the beauty of sport. That's actually what makes it amazing and interesting, right? It's doing it in that moment. No one knows the outcome, but that's the beauty of it. No one would watch if we knew. But that's the challenge, isn't it? The unknown. That's the scary bit.
I'm very excited to have you on, Caroline. I found you through, I actually think I found you through Mind Body Bike, which I did a couple of years ago. And yeah. And then I saw all the wonderful things you're doing. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself to everyone and your background, where you're from, and how you kind of got to where you are today.
Wow, that's a long story. So, sit back and no. Thanks, Heidi. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here. Introducing myself, well, I'm Caroline Anderson. I'm a psychologist. Been a psychologist for almost 20 years. So that's about 18 years now. Psychology was always my passion. It was something I was always interested in from sort of those late teen years. I always knew that that's the direction that I wanted to be heading in. So I went off and studied and so on. But at the same time, I was also an up-and-coming athlete at the time. So I fell into sort of martial arts and combat sports and found the sport that I ended up in, Taekwondo, and just happened to really enjoy it and love it. And never really thought much beyond that. It was just something that I just really enjoyed doing. I loved the adrenaline, the mental aspects of competing and fighting. Things kind of progressed quite quickly in sport. So there was kind of these two things happening at once. One was studying to be a psychologist, and one was finding a love and passion in this particular sport. At the time, I never thought the two would meet, in that I just really enjoyed my work in psychology and was focused more on clinical work, mental health, and so on, and sort of saw my career as an athlete as quite a separate thing. And when I ended up retiring from my sport, so I went on and competed internationally for many years and competed at the 2004 Olympics, and then after that decided I'd had enough and wanted to focus on my career. I still didn't kind of see them as I still saw them as quite separate entities. So, continued to focus on the next 8 to 10 years in sort of more mental health and clinical work. And it was probably about then 10 years ago now that I don't know, things happen for a reason, I guess, and there was sort of a number of sort of coincidences and things that came up that slowly got me back into sport from a professional sense. And when that started happening, I realised there was a great alignment of my interests, passion, knowledge, expertise, and it just really felt like I had been missing a piece and had found that piece when those sort of two areas of my life combined, and have obviously been working more and more in sport over the last 10 years. So that's predominantly what I do. But I think it's great having the background that I do in mental health, because obviously a lot of athletes do present with just general life challenges, mental health issues, but then also having the understanding, tools and knowledge to work from a performance perspective. So I can kind of work across the whole sort of domain. If an athlete comes to see me for performance stuff, but as we continue to work, maybe something else comes up outside of that initial presentation, we can easily pivot towards that. There's no sort of, oh, sorry, I can't do that. It's not an area that I work in. So I feel like it's great to be able to work across all those different aspects.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's like the full, you can like, the full range from like pointy end stuff, like, all the way to performance and that whole gamut, as well as your own lived experience as an athlete as well, and competing at such a high level. And I assume there was also, after that retirement, did you have to kind of refine that, like, oh, hang on, what's my relationship to sport, or how do I want to what do I actually want to do without that competitive side? Or did you continue competition?
Oh, no, I took a big step. I didn't want anything to do with sort of that elite level sport for a long time. I think I needed time to process my experience at the Olympic Games, what that meant. But I was also very ready to take on other, like to sort of, I'd spent so much, sport is a sacrifice. You spend a lot of time traveling, training, it's a huge time commitment. So I was definitely ready also just to have time to do other things. I was really excited about sort of pivoting and switching to other things. So we definitely, my partner and I, and our husband and I, we live a pretty adventurous lifestyle, and I don't compete anymore, and I definitely don't do my sport anymore, but we do plenty of other activities and outdoor stuff that it's not the same, but there are real similarities. I definitely miss that adrenaline rush from competing, and I get that in other sports that I do now recreationally and for fun. Things like snowboarding, mountain biking, just being outdoors in nature, all that stuff, and instilling that in the children, in our 3 kids, hopefully developing that passion and enjoyment for them in those areas. Yeah.
That's cool. Have you noticed in any of your kids that real competitive side or that drive, and you're like, no. Oh, that was that part of me that I see in you?
No. 2 of my kids are really not competitive at all, and it's actually hilarious because they just could not care. One of my children is competitive with not with sport, but she's very competitive with like board games and things like that. She likes to win, okay. But I haven't seen that transfer over to any kind of sport. So it's very interesting. But they enjoy, they enjoy being active and doing stuff.
Yeah. And that actually, I didn't include this in my notes, but do you find a lot of athletes, or you've noticed that people come to you with that real competitive edge, or that, because I mean, myself and a lot of my friends are extremely competitive, and I believe for me, I grew up as a twin, so I had to essentially compete for attention, and I'm not sure if that may be for other people that it stems from something that actually doesn't have to do with that sport. And if you're raised in a certain environment, it can change it. And I imagine working through other psychological themes in your life, do athletes ever lose that competitiveness, or they need to find a new motivation?
Sure. I'll answer the first bit first. Yes, I think a lot of people have either natural competitiveness, so it comes from sort of innate desire to win or do better or push themselves or to learn or to be the best that they can. And then in other instances, I think it stems from just the sport itself. So I'm thinking, I work with a lot of young gymnasts, for example. They're very, very young when they go into it, and they just love it. They have such determination, but I think it stems from the love of the sport, in particular. So I think there's those kind of, generally speaking, 2 categories. Do they lose that competitive edge? Absolutely, of course. I mean, sport's not easy, particularly when you've been doing it for a long time. There's so many challenges. For young athletes, there can be real challenges going through, obviously, that sort of those adolescent years when their friends aren't doing those things, and they're going out and having time to study and to have fun and do other things. I think that's a time when we can lose a little bit of that. What's it all about? Is it worth it? But times of injury, times of challenge, pressure can make us lose, sometimes want to pull away from that competitiveness. So that there's so many factors. We were talking earlier off recording about COVID. We all know that was obviously a big challenge for a lot of athletes during that time, particularly in Victoria or states where there was lockdown, because they weren't competing, and competing is often what motivates us because it gives us a goal to work towards. And so when young athletes weren't having that goal, I think a lot of people lost that drive and that competitiveness for sure during that time.
That's really interesting. And I guess that kind of leads me into, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but you're a sports psychologist now, or like that's one of your specialties with performance edge psychology. Why sports psychology? Like, who benefits from it and who do you see?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's definitely not just athletes. I mean, majority of our work is with athletes. In my private practice, we see, very young, like I said, young gymnasts as an example, young swimmers who all the way up to elite level. We work with a range of different sports. And I guess people are presenting in those areas. So I guess there's different reasons why people present. One would be there's a problem. So there's a problem that they're having, when faced with sports. So it could be in training and competition. It could be a big one, like probably a big chunk of the work that I do is performance anxiety. It's an area that I really love working in. So that would be often a reason why people present, because there's a problem. It could be other things, as I said, times of injury, lack of motivation, lack of enjoyment. Sometimes there's things more in the dynamic of the wider team that they're in, or coach relationship stuff. So there's so many reasons. If it's not that there's a particular problem, sometimes athletes are just curious and want to learn more. They know that what they're doing is important. They're at a certain level, and they just want to make sure that they're not leaving any stone unturned. And I think some people, athletes, families and so on, do have that mindset now, much more so than maybe 20 years ago, that it should be just part of the norm when we're at a certain level in sport. So just like having regular physio, massage, maybe nutrition, things that will help complement you to perform at your best. Performance psychology is just an element of that. So I guess there's a wide range of reasons. And as I said earlier, the third category would probably be those athletes that are struggling with mental health. It could be an eating disorder, it could be sleep difficulties, it could be relationship, life stressors, but they also want to work with someone who understands the context, pressures and environment of sport, that they want to work with someone who has some clue about what they're facing. So they would probably choose a performance psychologist in those instances. So that would be the main sort of areas. But like I said, it's not just athletes. We get people that see themselves as high performers in other contexts or in other professional contexts. So probably the second biggest category that I work with would be doctors. So probably specialists who are or doctors who are sitting their final, specialty exams to become a consultant in a particular area. They're really understanding that it's not just sometimes having the knowledge that is important, it's how we're applying it, it's what we're doing, it's how we prepare for those exams, particularly things like the oral or clinical exams. So they are really uptaking performance psychology to assist with those areas. But other professions, we sometimes have people applying for specialty jobs, so like special operations in the police force, or someone that want to make sure that they are preparing in the best way possible, not just physically but mentally as well. We've had people going on a reality TV show that want to prepare psychologically for that. So it can be all kinds of, and of course things like musicians, dancers, other kinds of performers as well.
Well, that's so cool, because it's so much wider than what I ever would have even imagined. And I guess in my head, when I saw that you did like commercial and business. I'm like, I wonder what kind of professions and what that looks like. But what you just said, I'm like, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, look, we often get asked to come out and give, talks or presentations to businesses where they are dealing with high pressure situations. So it might be a law firm, some sort of accounting firm in the city. I mean, they are working long hours. They're often, their well-being, self-care gets neglected because they're working so much, but they want to be the best that they can. And, people, working in those professions also have pressure, doubt, challenges, interpersonal issues. Really, it's all the same things that I see and work with in sport. And I think more and more people are seeing that connection and leaning towards that.
Yeah, it's even since starting the podcast, I've had a lot of people reach out to me and go, I've actually never thought of the link between like a holistic health and sport. And even when I've spoken to people about starting this podcast, they're like, wait, what? Like, how does that, do they even go together? And I'm like, yes, like it is massive, because I think you touched on it, that pressure. It's that pressure to want to do better, to excel. It's performance, it mirrors exactly what you said. People want to do really well in their work in high pressure environments, and sport can be that high pressure environment as well.
And just day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, mum's juggling. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel that, juggling a job, looking after kids, maintaining the family, like there is a lot of pressures in modern day life, and for all of us. And the tools, techniques that we use as psychologists, whether it's for, someone competing at the Olympics for the first time, or like I said, someone in a completely different walk of life, or someone recreationally, going down a mountain really fast on a mountain bike, all those things are intrinsically linked. All the skills, the ideas and the concepts are all the same things, just applied in different ways.
Yeah, and I think I often talk about skills crossing over, and people usually think those physical skills such as, air control and body awareness and things, but people don't often think about like the mental tools that you can take on that translates into so many different areas. And I think that's why so many people are drawn to extreme sports specifically, because it does mirror back other ways in your life that you can apply those skills, and it can cross over. Talking about
Absolutely.
pressure.
And
sorry.
I was just going to say, for me, if I'm pushing myself, doing something different in a sport, like, as I said, snowboarding or mountain biking, or it could be even just running, it does have a direct, crossover into knowing that I'm leaning into uncomfortable things, challenges, overcoming my own fears. And then I know that applies to other areas of my life, even socially, professionally. We know that the more we lean into those things, the more that we can endure and manage moments of discomfort, moments of challenge in all areas of life.
It's a big confidence win. So pressure, how do you see that manifest, and what kinds of pressures do you see? And then from that, what tools can be helpful?
Yeah, pressure is a huge one. Someone competing at their, local club competition can experience pressure, pressure to perform. They know that their family takes them to training, every day. They don't want to disappoint their family. They don't want to disappoint their coaches. I mean, we know all that stuff, all the way up to, knowing that you've worked 10 years for this moment at a world championships, at a world Olympic Games, whatever it is. There is pressure, in sport and in life. Usually, I guess a big part of it, though, is the pressure we put on ourselves, right? The fear of losing, of it's a loss, a threat to our ego, isn't it? Really, that fear of failure, and if we put aside all those external things, there are those things, but I do think that internal threat that we fear is the one that we fear the most, and sure, judgment from other people. What are people going to think and say? How are they going to view me? How are they going to see me? Now, the reality is most of the time people couldn't care. They support you. They don't. Yeah, it's usually our own mind saying those things the most, the loudest. There's pressure from media, from sponsors for elite athletes. I mean, there's many different areas that we can experience that, of course. In terms of how do we cope, I think part of it is how we're going to view that, how we're going to take on board and manage our own expectations. And then I think part of it is also literally the psychological skills around what are we choosing to focus on in this moment. Yeah, so a lot of the stuff would be about the kinds of skills that I work with people on would be from a cognitive perspective. So how do we think about the automatic thoughts that pop up that say, oh, people are going to judge you if you don't do well, or you can't do this, or it's all too hard, or you haven't got what it takes. All those thoughts, I don't know, I think people out there sometimes think that those thoughts are unusual and we shouldn't have them. I would say the opposite. I would say that those thoughts are very normal, very appropriate. It's really, and the more that we try to fight and stop those thoughts, the more we send ourselves the message that those kinds of thoughts are bad, the more distress it's going to cause. So I think that the approach that I would take is understanding why we have those kinds of thoughts. Why do we as humans doubt? Why do we worry about worst case scenarios? Why do we think what if and I should and maybe I'm not good enough? I would say all of those things, as I said, are completely normal. In fact, almost stemming back to our survival and, protecting us in some way. So once we start to shift that perception, our response is very different. Rather than fighting it, arguing against it, denying it, not wanting to listen to that stuff or agreeing with it, whatever we do, we can respond differently. We can normalize that. We can choose how we, whether we continue to listen and get caught up in that stuff. And the two questions I will always get people to ask themselves are, is that kind of thinking, is it helpful and is it true? Now, it may or may not be true. We often don't know the answer, but we sure like to pretend like it is true. Yeah. And most of the time it's not helpful. So if that's the case, then we can learn how to just not to pay as much attention, buy into, get us sucked up by those kind of cognitive experiences that come up. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that we can learn. I guess then in terms of managing pressure, we also feel it, right? What do we feel? We feel anxiety, we feel stress, we feel fear, in the face of pressure. So I guess the next step is sort of how do we sit with those feelings, because most of us don't like those feelings very much. To feel anxious, it's an uncomfortable experience. Our heart starts racing, we feel nauseous. I work with many athletes of all different levels who get so anxious before racing, competing a match that they'll vomit. And if people don't understand why those things are occurring, why their body is doing that, it can be a very scary place. Yeah, it can feel very uncomfortable, wrong, bad. Whereas when we start to learn why our body is doing it, what are the effects of adrenaline and cortisol in our system? And when people start to understand that, hey, this is a normal body response. In fact, it's not even a bad thing. It's a great thing for majority of sports where you're using your body to perform. So, you're going to get your body is trying to mobilize you. Remember, it's sensing some sort of threat or danger. Your body is going to mobilize your resources to put energy where it's going to help you run away or fight, which is basically your major muscle groups. And it's going to try to conserve energy where it's not needed. So it'll switch off the digestive system. It's not really that's a waste of energy in that moment. So that makes us feel a bit yucky and a bit nauseous. But that's not a bad thing. That's good for sport. We don't want to be wasting energy in that moment. We want to be putting energy towards, firing our muscles. So when people start to interpret those physiological experiences differently and understand them in a different way, they can learn to, I guess, not just accept, but embrace those uncomfortable sensations that people experience in high pressure moments. Yeah. But if we continue to want to fight it, run away from it, change it, get rid of it, I think that that's often where the biggest sort of problematic areas occur.
Yeah, that the acceptance piece is so interesting, because even I notice within myself that sometimes I'm like, why is this happening? I don't want this to happen right now. Rather than being like, no, this is a normal physiological response to how I'm feeling. It's okay. And it will pass. And like what's in my control. And I'm so interested to hear about like control in that pressure environment as well, because I imagine a lot of people feel pressure as well because they want to control an outcome and they want to control how they're feeling.
Oh yes,
to then
of course,
into
that's
the
human
sport.
nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
What does anxiety want? It wants to be like, what do we want? We want to get rid of anxiety. How do we do that? Well, we think we've got to fix it or control it. So there's two ways we can do that. We can avoid the danger, the threat, which is the fear of loss. Just like seeing a tiger, we can run away, we can avoid, or we can try to... when we talk about fight or flight, the fight response makes it sound like it's aggression or something. It's not aggression. It's not being angry necessarily. It can be. It's usually that desire to want to control or fix the threat. So if it was a tiger, I would get that fight or flight response. As I said, I can either run away or I can try to build, some walls around my village. I can, make some bows and arrows. It's kind of giving me the energy to try to control and fix that scenario. So what's that got to do with modern life? The control and fixing is often a repeated pattern we see people falling into. So what that manifests and looks like today is I feel threatened, therefore anxious, going into a major event or a competition or something. So how can I get rid of that? I can try to control and fix this by overtraining. Yeah, so if I train more than everybody else, then I feel like I'm doing something. I'm active. I'm doing more than everybody else. It's reassuring to my anxiety. Sort of makes sense, sounds good. I'm not saying don't train. We have to train hard as athletes. But overtraining, well, what happens? Yes, it reassures anxiety, leads to fatigue, leads to burnout, leads to risk of injury. Yeah. So overtraining. Over planning is the other one, where we just sort of think, trying to always, or I guess that links into overthinking. Yeah. So that's probably the number one thing that we do in the face of, anxiety is trying to, if we can't avoid it, we're going to overthink it, overplan. So it's like wanting to know every little detail, wanting to think about what I'm doing, how I'm going to do this, what's going to happen. I'm going to keep thinking about it. But usually we just keep going around worst case scenarios. All that does is bring up more anxiety and stress response, probably not always a helpful thing. So learning to understand and recognize some of those responses is really important. And the great paradox with control, if we think about it from, think about the emotion of anxiety, the more that we try to control anxiety by telling ourselves this is bad, I want to get rid of it, the great paradox is that we probably have more of it. Yeah. And there's lots of little fun, metaphors and examples that we often talk about. But I mean, that's the reality of it. The more you try to get rid of it, the more you're going to get it. And the great paradox is then that we do the opposite. The more that we accept, sit with, some discomfort, the less likely we are, not to get rid of it completely maybe, because as we said, it's natural and normal, but just to reduce, it will definitely not be as intense as when we fight it. And the thing in sport is, a lot of the messaging in the system is that control piece, is about trying to get rid of anxiety, be calm, be confident. but the athlete's thinking, but I'm not calm, I'm not confident. Oh, that's bad. I should try to control that. And then the more they control that, probably the worse they feel.
Yeah, I feel like you just spoke to my soul.
Yeah, me too, 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like it even it translates in my personal life majorly, but in terms of like a sports sense, even like when I go and I travel, right? Say we're going to Thredbo to ride bikes and we've traveled 8 hours to get there, taking time off work, spending money, and you only have maybe 2 days that you're riding out of say the 4 or 5 that you're there, and you just want to be on. And it's so funny because the last couple of times I've been there, I haven't been. It's been like I've been bleeding and it's been a little bit, I've been all over the place. Or the other time I went, there was like a big emotional thing that came up for me and I was like, oh my goodness. But it didn't negate or take away from the experience for me. And I was still in beautiful Thredbo. The land and the country there is stunning. I was with amazing people and I had such a good time. And my performance may not have been at that, at my peak, but I had such a good time. And I think sometimes it can be really easy. And if you're an elite athlete, obviously this is a very different thing because
it's not. No, it's the same thing. Honestly, everything you're saying, I think translates exactly. I love that story, and I think that does translate directly to being an elite athlete. The more, there are certain times where that one competition is the only thing that matters. Even it's a grand statement. But, athletes are competing all the time, there's multiple events. And when we have that mindset of this is the only thing that matters, this is the most important thing, we lose sight of the bigger picture. We lose sight of, well, why did I start the sport in the first time? What am I even here? We lose sight of that enjoyment. We lose sight of the learning along the way. And I think, and we do get very outcome focused. I'm not saying we can never think of outcomes in sport, but I think it's secondary. I think all this other stuff that you're talking about is, okay, sometimes we need to accept that it's not our best performance, but there's still a rich experience, there to have if we're going to focus on it. And if we lose sight of that, I think over the long term, competing can feel very unsatisfying, in fact, very draining, very, very difficult. And I think it can perpetuate vicious cycles. So I think having, and that thing around, why do we compete, or even athlete identity, if the sole purpose or part of your identity is to win, I think that can be problematic. I think if that's part of your identity, sure, to be determined, to do the best that you can, absolutely. But there has to be a bigger picture here in it, for every athlete, about camaraderie, teammateship, sense of adventure, traveling the world. Like all these things are amazing opportunities, whether you're winning or not. And I think that actually helps us in the long term to win better and win well.
Oh, that's so true. I feel like that's a massive moment. And I guess it kind of intertwines into that control piece because it is the process rather than the outcome. And it's about, okay, what am I getting out of this? And it's the same in business too. It's like, you can always get more money. There's more to win. There's more deals that you can close. There's more. But it's actually
promotion.
Well, and it's like, well, what's the process? Where am I at? How can I enjoy it? And
what are the values? I mean,
within that.
Yeah, and look, there's a big shift in organisational settings, and I'm sure of Simon Sinek's work and all that sort of stuff. There is a real leaning into that, isn't there? That it's not just about money and the next thing and the promotion, because we end up on that hedonistic sort of treadmill of, okay, now I've done that, tick the box, now what? Whereas I think, and that's very unfulfilling, I think, so I think there is a real awareness out there that it is about purpose, values, mission, all those kinds of things. And that is what drives us in the long term. It's sustainable. It's means that we can, I think, achieve our best in a much better way for our well-being, our health. It's driven by opportunity and challenge rather than by threat, because in the other way, there's either a win or a loss. You either tick the box or you don't. I'm either winning or losing. That is kind of constantly engaging in that threat response.
And that identity piece is so interesting, because it's a reflection of yourself in that as well, in that win or lose. And then do you deal a lot with imposter syndrome as well, that people, it's then I guess about their confidence and self-trust and whether they believe, I guess it's that threat versus that self-confidence, and how does one navigate that?
Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. Of course. So, look, imposter syndrome, yes, in sport, I probably see that more professionally. A lot of people presenting with that sense of, they've had achievement and success in, professionally and in sport, whichever, and feeling like they're going to get found out, they're a fraud, they've somehow been lucky. I 100% had imposter syndrome as an athlete, because I had a very quick rise, kind of happened all quite quickly. And it just wasn't something that I had pictured, when I first started out. So it just seemed to have kind of happened. And I now know that's because I just loved it and was really passionate about it, that happened in that way. But I remember kind of walking down in the Olympic Village, down the main street, and going, oh my God, what am I doing here? I'm just Caroline from the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. This is so weird. How did I end up here? So yeah, it's a completely very common, normal thing. How that ties – look, I love talking about confidence, and all the athletes that I work with, they'll probably go, oh, so sick of hearing Caroline talk about this. I always talk about confidence because it's something that I think is really, really important. And I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there in sport, in society about confidence. So there's a lot of emphasis on confidence, saying it's like it's kind of this really important element for success. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying, it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's never important. I'm just, my take on it would be it's probably not as important as what we think it is. And the reason is, the way that I would see it is that confidence is an emotion. That confidence is just something that we feel confident, right? And so if we're thinking about it in that sense, it's natural and normal, and I'm sure we all agree that emotions all come and they go. They're not permanently around. So if I was to say to you, Heidi, in order for you to perform well, you have to be happy. Yeah. What would your response be to that?
My response would be, well, what makes me happy? It's like sitting in the sun, for example, and lighting myself up. But I know if you asked me that even like a year ago, I would be like, oh, well, like I'm not happy with my life. I'm not happy with where I'm at. I'm not happy with – it felt so out of my space. However, now I'm like, I know that it's an emotion, and it's like, okay, well, what makes me happy? There's music that makes me happy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So there are certain things that you could do to feel a bit happier. Yeah. And there's things that there is some control around that, right? But can we always control it and flick it on like a switch when we want it in that moment? No, we understand that it's a process, and sometimes it's there, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's a bit harder. Sometimes we wake up and it's just, even if we do those things, sometimes we still won't, necessarily feel happy. So that kind of is very similar when it comes to confidence, except there's this expectation that we should be able to just switch it on and have it without understanding the nuance of that. It comes and goes. Now, my argument would be that, when we the closer we get to something new, different, challenging, hard, potentially threatening, what's a natural, normal response is the uncertainty of that. We don't know what the future holds, and with uncertainty comes anxiety. As anxiety comes up, I would say it's pretty normal for confidence to go down a little bit. Yeah, there's this kind of delicate sort of dance that goes on between those two things. And if we're kind of saying, okay, that's a normal thing to happen, but we don't want it to happen. We don't want to not feel confident. We're going to put all our time and energy into trying to feel confident, whereas it's an oxymoron because it's not something we can just click our fingers and make happen. And so we're going to kind of fail at that, yeah? And then we're going to feel bad. And because we feel bad, that's problematic. Yeah, I feel like that's a problem. Everyone tells me to be confident. Oh, I've tried all these things. I'm not really just feeling confident in this moment. Therefore, I'm going to perform bad. Yeah, I think that's really problematic. What I would say is how you feel doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how you're going to perform unless you believe it does. So I certainly know from my experience, I had times when I was feeling great, confident, and I performed really well, and that's a nice little connection to make. Feel good, perform good. I also know that I've had times of not feeling good, not feeling confident, and not performing well. Okay, yes, agree with all those things, but there's more to the story, right? I know that I've had times when I felt really great going into a fight, many years ago, and didn't win, didn't come out the way that I wanted. Okay, that's interesting. I've also had times of not really feeling it, not feeling confident, but in the moment, for whatever reason, maybe it's focus, maybe it was just technique, the drills I was practicing, maybe I was in the right mindset, who knows? Regardless of being confident or not, I've been able to have a successful competition. So there's kind of a range of different ways that we can feel and perform, and it's not only one correlation of feel good, perform good. Yeah, and I think that that's a really important message to have out there. So if it's not how we're feeling that determines a successful performance, even though that's what feels good, even though we like that one, well, what is it? Well, it's our behaviours, our action, our focus, they're the things that will determine whether we perform well or not. Yeah. There's a sports psychologist in Australia, so I'm not going to steal his words, but he once said to me, competence over confidence. And I really like that. I think that that's a really important differentiator. So when people like to, they're like, when I start working with athletes and they're really focused on that word confidence, I go, no, change it to another C word, competence, because competence is a much more stable factor, isn't it? Right? Like you can go from one day thinking you're great and the next day thinking you're terrible, right? But your competence can't have changed unless you're injured or something, right? Like you can't suddenly go from being able to execute your skill or whatever in your sport to not being able to do it the next day. It's not possible. And yet that can happen very easily with how we feel about it, our interpretation of it. So we focus on more of those stable factors like competence and the bigger picture.
Yeah, incredible. So incredible. And it because it ties into that control piece, because you've done everything within your control to train, to eat well, and it's like in that moment I know that I've done as best as I can to get me to this position. And where if you focus on how you feel, it's like, oh, I don't feel good today, which I'm guilty of doing. It's like, oh, I don't feel good. Like I've got to be really careful. And, rather than I'm competent, like I've ridden this many times, I've surfed here before, I have the knowledge to, and that's where that self-trust comes in. Competence over confidence. I absolutely love that, because I think confidence is such a hot topic, and it's something that so many people chase.
It is.
Even in everyday life, it's like, oh, I want to be confident.
Yes.
And it's so interesting because I go to events and I don't feel confident, but I always feel competent that I can ride the trails, I can show up.
That's right.
I know what I'm doing.
Yes.
And it's such a massive shift, which I think is terrific.
You've got the skills, right? That doesn't mean you're going to execute them perfectly. No one knows the future. No one knows what's going to happen. But it does mean that you have the skill set required. And that's really all that we can ask ourselves, isn't it? Isn't that all that we can ask of ourselves, to show up, to know that we have the skill set, the capacity to execute those skills? whether we do or not, well, that's the beauty of sport. That's actually what makes it amazing and interesting, right? It's doing it in that moment. No one knows the outcome, but that's the beauty of it. No one would watch if we knew. But that's the challenge, isn't it? The unknown. That's the scary bit.
Yeah, and I assume like tools that help with competence, and because I imagine too, like visualization, for example, would come into that. If you're visually seeing and if you're visualizing your competence, it would change your feelings and it would change your hormones, and it would almost flow on as well from that. So I can imagine that like visualization and is also powerful of where your focus is.
Of course. Look, of course. I mean, athletes have been doing it for a long time. A friend of mine, Lauren Burns, she won gold medal in the Sydney 2000 Olympics in my sport in Taekwondo. And she went on to do a PhD exploring the performance lifestyle factors that she interviewed, I think it was about 20 or 30 of Australia's gold medalists, and was really looking at what are some of the commonalities in these really elite, high-performing athletes that have won a gold medal for Australia. And so some of there was kind of there was a number of themes, but one of the themes was visualization as being key to something that all these athletes had in common. And another one was the kind of quality of their relationships and supports that they had around them. So the sort of interpersonal relationships with their coach, support staff, even families, friends, and so on. So they were two really important factors that came out from the research. But yeah, absolutely, visualization. I think we call it now probably more mental imagery because it's semantics, but the only difference is visualization makes it sound like it's just a visual experience, whereas what we're trying to bring about is visual, auditory, sensory, sort of make it a richer experience when we do the rehearsal, the visualization, and that's going to make it more real and bring about more learning in that way. Yeah, and of course it gives us again, it probably taps in more into that sense of control, that athletes can do something, that there's without just sort of overtraining and doing stuff. I think it does make them feel like they're doing more. And of course, there's that element of brain learning that goes on there.
Because I don't know the study or where it comes from, but I have heard of people. I think Dr. Tara Swart or something, she's a neuroscientist, and she was talking about how they had a group of people that like half of them were lifting weights and half of them were using mental imagery.
Yep.
And a lot of the people that were using mental imagery, their muscle mass increased.
Well, they were doing the same program, so they were doing the gym, but they were also doing mental imagery.
Also, okay.
So and they also, yes, cool. Yes. And so with the combination of the two, they had more muscle growth. Yeah, absolutely.
So incredible. The mind's pretty powerful.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Speaking on identity, it's so interesting because I've seen a lot of people that are maybe new to events and they're like, oh my gosh, or new to a sport, but at events in particular, they're like, there's so many people here, and they can't perform to their usual ability because they're so focused on everyone around them. And as well as when it's, say, a busy day on the trails, I have people that just pull to the side because they think that they're in the way or that they're not as much of a mountain biker or an athlete, and they have less of they don't have they deserve to not be in that position. And I often say to them, I'm like, you are here and you're allowed to be here just as much as someone else is. And I have other friends who surfing's a big one because a lot of people even ask me like, oh, you're a surfer. And I go, well, I like to surf. I don't know if I'd call myself a surfer because I'm not super consistent with it and it's not something that I'm doing often. And same with mountain biking. People are like, oh, you're a mountain biker. And I'm like, oh, I love to ride bikes. But I don't know if that is like something that I would call myself, a mountain biker. And I can imagine, I imagine at a high level people probably would be like, yeah, like I'm a runner, I'm a fighter, I'm a
Yes,
snowboarder,
that's right.
I'm this.
That's right.
And then it's like, what happens if I'm not that? And do you deal with athletes that are like over, like they're retiring from their careers?
Of course. Yeah. So that's another, I probably didn't mention that, but that's a really huge piece in the sporting landscape. It's probably been the last 10 years where it's become very, very important. We know from the research how challenging that time can be. All the things that you're talking about, our identity. So a lot of the time, many athletes, look, and it depends on, are they professional? Are they getting paid to do what they do? There's many sports where they're still full-time athletes, but they don't get paid. So they've kind of had to either have other work or, studies or something. There's all different scenarios. But at the end of the day, for majority of sports, it's going to end one day. Yeah, that we can't be an elite swimmer at age 50, I assume. Maybe golf is one where it has a pretty long, cycling, there's certain sports that have quite a long career, but it's going to end eventually. And we always say, you need to start planning for that now, because a lot of athletes, particularly, I think it's less common now, but particularly back a way ago, they almost felt like focusing on something else was kind of meaning that they weren't as dedicated. Oh, it's like I'm kind of trying to have two eggs in one basket. And I've got a plan B in case this doesn't work out, and that's going to reduce my determination in some sort of way. I think that probably was an older mentality. The problem with that was, yes, it meant that they were very tied up with that identity of being an athlete. They didn't have other hobbies. I mean, this still happens. So I talk to athletes who get injured. I'm like, right, so you can't train 30 hours a week like you would normally. What are your hobbies? What are your interests? I don't know. I've never done anything else. They've never picked up a guitar or played a different game, or had to think about how else do we spend time at home and do stuff, because their identity is so fixed on being an athlete. So yes, this happens all the time. And when that happens, and then when eventually people do transition out of sport, it brings up, some pretty serious, it can bring up and has brought up some pretty serious mental health issues. We know in Australian sport there has been suicides as a result of leaving sport, which is obviously a really challenging and difficult thing to even think about and to, but we've had to really in the sporting world absolutely identify and work through that. So, I mean, the AFL cricket professional codes have been sort of for many, many years now providing free, ongoing psychological support for athletes that are either in the sport or transitioning out. I've seen athletes through the AFL cricket that retired 10 years ago, and the sport still funds those appointments, even 15 years ago, whatever. The AIS back in 2018 started the AIS Mental Health Referral Network. So any categorised athlete has access to a select number of psychologists around Australia, and we can see those athletes again, whether they're currently competing or have retired or in that transition phase. So that's been a really, these measures are very preventative. There's a lot more education in the sporting world as well around identity and, making sure that, AFL has certain criteria. I think it's like 8 hours a week that they have to do study or work of some description to make sure that we're setting up these people for success when they transition out of sport. So definitely it's a very big topic and has been for a number of years, and is really, really important and something that we still talk about all the time with athletes.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it's super, super important to keep them, supported. And what would you say to those people at the start, or not even at the start of their career, but maybe they're getting into something sort of like what I mentioned before, they're getting into surfing or they're getting into mountain biking and they have that imposter syndrome. And we touched on confidence versus competence. What happens when that competence is low and you doubt your competence? So
that's different.
And that, I guess, imposter syndrome. Yes. It's like, how can I excel here, or how can they show up? Because around my age group, it's so common, and I have so many people that don't even give it a go.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so lots of different, things to think about in this sense. I guess I would come back to, look, it's a growth mindset thing, right? Like if you're newer to the sport, you're just not there yet. It doesn't mean you're not going to get there, but you're not there yet. And exposure and repeated exposure is the best way to get there. So the more you show up for those competitions, the more you have. This is humans in anything, right? Exposure therapy, basic 101. The more that we do something, the easier it does get. That's some basic stuff. So I think people sometimes, are a bit impatient, and they think, well, the first time they show up, they should get it right and succeed and, not struggle there. That is just a completely normal experience to, especially I think in some of these sports where it's not like it's, going to be an age group thing or like, depending on their age, but, or like beginners or amateurs. It's just kind of everyone thrown in together. There's going to be a range of different people out there on the track, and that's okay. Like, that is completely fine. And again, the more that we open up to that and are okay with that and give ourselves that time, we're still in that learning and growth and development stage to get to that competence piece and to develop those skills. And you're not going to get there unless you actually do it, because you can mountain bike on your own. It's not the same as mountain biking with people coming behind you. So that's a great experience to have. And so they need to learn to embrace that, I think, a little bit, and come back to, again, why are they there? Is it important to them? What's the purpose in this? And really focusing on that value as a reason to keep showing up again and again. The last one was about probably comparisons. Like, we as humans are really great at comparisons. We're really good at worrying about what everyone else is thinking. Again, a natural innate response to have. Probably just something to acknowledge, and just not to get too caught up in. We have, like you said, they have every right to be there and to experience it. And I'd probably just say normalise that a little bit.
And it's something that I've noticed a lot with, because I guess my experiences have been, I very much have been introduced to something through family or through a boyfriend, and I've always been in, like, amongst everyone. And a lot of extreme sports and a lot of sports can be male dominated, and I think there's a lot of female groups out there, which is so great for that initial step and creating that safe space. And I've noticed a lot of people or women or people that go to the women's groups, they struggle to break out of those women's groups. And what you said, it's that exposure to, hang on, like, okay, what does this now look like? What does the field or the people around me, what's their experience and how is this different? And it comes, I guess, from acceptance as well, that everyone's here to do the same thing. And it may look a little bit different for other people, but it's that exposure, and it's that trying not to compare and trying not to even control within that space.
And I think particularly in some of the sports you've mentioned, it is about, like, there are bigger things going on. It is about enjoyment. It is about nature. It is about pushing ourselves, trying something different. So again, sort of we have a choice to focus on that bit or to focus on the not so good bits, the challenges, difficulties, the discomfort. I guess learning how to switch your focus to those things is important.
Yeah, I like that shift of focus, which actually kind of leads me to my next question, which is, do you deal with a lot of athletes with ADHD, and what are some tools, I guess, or how does it manifest in athletes or within people within their sports? Because I think we hear about how it manifests in the classroom, how it manifests in business, in work, in personal life, but what does that actually look like in a sporting or sports sense?
Yeah.
Or performance even. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but from the work that I've done with athletes with ADHD, I usually don't see it. I usually don't see detrimental impacts in their sport necessarily. I see a lot of benefits from ADHD, that hyper focus, obviously having that, lots of energy to put into their sport, and it's a real channel. It's often a coping mechanism, or like in a healthy way, healthy coping, to be doing their sport, the hours that they're doing, the amount, have that focus. So I often find it probably less impacts in terms of in the sport, but probably more impacts personally and socially and academically. So usually it would be supporting them in areas outside of sport, which then if they're, able to manage the things outside of sport, then that's going to benefit their sport anyway and their performance. So that's probably just in my experience what I've seen more of. So a lot of support with schools, with making sure that they're getting the support that they need and that they've got the tools and the skills to manage in that environment. Is it problem? Are there problematic features?
Burnout?
There would be things.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's probably the one I would say is there's that sort of classic ADHD burnout, but I think that happens. Can potentially happen for anybody these days. I often see burnout with perfectionists, with people that, are so determined and working so hard to do everything perfectly, everything right all the time, do more, which obviously people with ADHD can do. That I would say is just a common thing that we see, to the point of, as I said, injury, health issues, not being able to enjoy their sport or even do their sport for a period of time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess so. Sport can be used as a way to help with the ADHD and maybe help in the personal life and holistically.
For many people. Yes, I think
totally.
I think sport. There's research around really endurance sports, so marathon, ultra marathon. That there's a high correlation of people with trauma backgrounds in those sports, and I won't go into all the reasons, but sport can be a great coping tool for life stressors. It can be an outlet. It can be an area of positive focus. For me, I remember when I was training after I finished uni, I was working full time. So for me, my sport became like just a way of de-stressing. I mean, I was at the elite level at this stage, but it was great. I'd finish work, go to training, and it was a great de-stressor from the day. I didn't have to think about my work. I think there's so many, but I think it can be a real positive coping strategy and outlet for people in their lives.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's because I have a lot of friends in the extreme sports, and so many of them have ADHD, and that impulsivity, it excels them in the sports because they're like, let's go for it, let's do it. It's pretty cool to see that.
Does that ever mean that they're like, are they taking? I'm just interested. Are they sometimes taking risks because of that impulsivity that then, and they're in an extreme sport? I guess that could be a risk, couldn't it, of
big time
doing something. And there's a big, in sport, there's a fine line. I think I often talk to athletes about having to take risks. And it's not always about physical safety risks, but you do have to step outside of that comfort zone, take that chance, take that opportunity. So I wonder, and again, I would see people with ADHD potentially having opportunities there, but I guess sometimes in extreme sports, I wonder if they're not thinking through the potential negative consequences of their actions.
I totally see that, and it then results in injury. Injury, as no matter what level you're at, is so tricky to navigate, in my opinion. Yeah. It's because you're going from like go, and you're doing all these things to sometimes like you can't get out of bed. And it's like, and it kind of like slaps you, and there's no preparation for it, and you find yourself there.
Absolutely.
And I think
absolutely.
I know for myself, some of my darkest times has been through injuries and broken bones and surgeries that you have to get. And I guess when exercising is that coping mechanism, and you, for example, like you break your arm and it's your hand you write with or your arm you write with, it loses that ability to draw, to write, to have like almost like your basic needs met by yourself. It can be so difficult to navigate. And what do you focus on, or what perspective do you take when it does come to athletes and injuries? Because I imagine that's a massive part of your work.
Yeah, of course. And exactly all the things that you've just said. I mean, I was injured a year before the Olympics and had a fracture in my back, my lower back. And I remember how difficult that was, you know. And I was like, and there was no certainty that I'd get back and what would happen. And it was a very difficult time. But from my personal experience, what it actually, you know, I guess I was able to pivot towards what does this give me? Yeah. And what I probably didn't know it at the time. It was probably down the track and afterwards that it gave me a break. You know, I probably was getting a bit fatigued, tired from the intensity being in the bubble. So it gave me a break, gave me rest, which was probably the best thing a year out from the Olympics. It gave me an opportunity to reflect because, as I said, you know, sport comes with challenges, it's sacrifice. It gave me a chance to reflect, hey, there are these sacrifices that you have to make, but it's worth it. You know, I realized it kind of reinvigorated my passion and love for the sport because I couldn't actually do it. And by the time, in the end, the injury was only sort of 3 months and healed very quickly and I was back out there. But it was probably the best thing that ever happened because it invigorated me. It refreshed my love and passion for it when maybe I was just starting to get a bit tired and lots of travel and pressure and all those things. And so, you know, I sometimes share that story with athletes, but I think it is what are we going to get from this? You know, what are the benefits? Can we learn to utilize this time to play around with some meditation, mindfulness, focus, concentration tasks? You know, if physically we can't even move and be active, how do we work on your well-being and your health and relationships? Look for those opportunities for growth in other areas. It's not always direct training that's going to give us those things, and all of those things outside of our training and sport can have huge benefits for then when we're playing sport or doing sport.
Yeah, that's so true. And do you the rest piece that's so interesting. And do you find a lot of elite athletes struggle to rest?
Of course, yes. Yeah. I think. I think not just
a lot of humans struggle.
Humans. That's what I was going to say. I think again, it's one of the real commonalities of modern life is we really struggle to rest. We really struggle to know how to do that. I think people that are more prone towards anxiety can tend to be, you know, use busyness as a technique to manage anxiety, as an example. So if I'm busy all the time, if I'm always doing stuff, I'm feeling like I'm more in control and doing more things, and I don't have to sit with discomfort. I don't have to sit with thoughts, worries, things that are on my mind. I can just keep busy and keep moving through that. Now, I'm not saying being busy and active is always bad, but I think you know, our nervous systems do start to suffer, I think, a little bit through the constant activation of that sympathetic nervous system response. And we're not particularly great of knowing how to activate our parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest system. I think a lot of the time we then oscillate to things like binge watching TV, or obviously the most common one, scrolling on our phones and devices. And so those things, fine, they do rest our body, of course, because we're sitting still, but that doesn't mean it's actual rest. And so helping people learn and develop other ways of deactivating, this is really important when athletes go overseas and, you know, travel for competitions, always something that we're talking about. How are we going to get not just physical rest and recovery, but mental rest and recovery?
And what are some examples of things that help with mental and physical rest and recovery?
Yeah. My personal one is reading. I am an avid reader. I love it. I read for pleasure. I read, obviously things to do with work, but I actually just love switching off. It's part of my bedtime routine, so I make sure I always give myself enough time to read, to deactivate, and have that good transition to bedtime routine. But look, it could be anything. It can be arts and crafts. It can be hobbies. It could be a musical instrument. It could be yoga, stretching. It can be listening to music. It can be having a hot bath. It can be going for a gentle walk, cooking. Look, there's so many activities, but it's really, are we doing it mindfully or with a full mind? Any of those activities we can physically be doing, but not actually be resting and recovering. So don't some people go, oh yeah, but I did yoga and I did this and I did that and I went for a walk. Yeah, but what were you thinking about? Where was your mind at? Because you can go for a walk and just be thinking about what you're going to cook for dinner and what's going to happen tomorrow and blah, blah, blah. And that's not a restful, engaging activity.
Yeah, it's that rumination. It's like, well, what's going on? Because then you're not mentally resting. Even it's like you want to go out for a walk, a gentle walk, and you're like looking at the trees in the sky and you're pondering, that bird, I wonder where it lives, and little things like that you let your mind explore, rather than focusing on being, what's the next thing I have to do.
Yes. So it's that real skill of what we call being present, right? And I think it's a skill unless we're aware of it and something that we're doing deliberately is very easy to lose sight of. So one study looked at this concept, there's kind of these a quick way of describing this would be we're either in default mode, so default mode in our brain is a range of different areas of the brain that are being activated where we're thinking about the past, the future, ourselves or other people. So that's kind of that rumination, you think about what's going to happen, what did happen. And sometimes that's very pleasant. Default mode isn't always bad. I could be thinking about my upcoming trip to Europe, and that's very pleasant. It's not like that's a bad thing. Or I could be stressing about a presentation I have to give next week. So default mode can often resort to those more emotional-based ones where they're threatening or scary or sad or disappointment can show up. So that's the default mode. Then we have what's called task positive network, which is areas of the brain associated with attention, concentration, the motor cortex and our sensory cortex. Yeah. So you can't be in both of these at once. You're either in one or the other. Yeah. How often have we driven a car, gotten from A to B and can't remember how we got there? It's because we've been in default mode. And so some recent studies have shown that we spend about up to 80% of our lives in this default mode, in modern society. That's actually quite shocking, really. It means that 80% of the time we are doing something that we're not actually thinking about. Yeah, so only 20% of the time we're doing an activity that we're actually thinking about, we're focusing on it. So task positive network combines sort of a task or a skill and that sensory experience of that moment. That's how we engage that task positive network. And I think that, there's a lot of, we don't always go around thinking about this stuff or being aware of it. But once we do become aware, there's much more of a choice to say, okay, I can switch over to what's the task at hand? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling in this moment? And all of this has direct then links back to performance, obviously to well-being, to mental health, to, performance. Because what do we want to do when we're performing? Do we want to be thinking about what we're cooking for dinner or what's going to happen in the next moment or whether am I going to win, whether am I going to lose? Or do we just want to be thinking about the execution of the skill and where I'm at, at this point in time? And so it's something that we do have to harness and train ourselves to maybe do a bit more of.
And I think this one, especially individuality and what works for you, is so important in this as well, because it can be, for some people it might be going for that gentle walk, but if you can't switch off, maybe it's listening to music and going for that gentle walk, or it's colouring in while listening to music.
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm quite, I don't like as a rule say everyone has to do an hour of mindfulness meditation every day. No way. Most people just are not going to do that. That works for some people. And some people go and do yoga retreats or meditation retreats and things like that. That floats their boat. That's great. I don't do an hour of mindfulness every day. I don't expect other people to do that. But finding those little things and sometimes challenging ourselves to not just automatically pick up the phone, to make other choices.
Mm. And I mean that comes down to like why people come to a sports psychologist is because they want to work on their own individual way of excelling, of performing better, of chilling out, of So, and I guess that's why like people like yourself are available and therapists are there as a guide and as a mentor to help people figure that out as well, rather than listening to, I should be doing this or should be doing that.
Well, there's so much information. Sometimes it's information overload, isn't there? And there's so many different perspectives and, yes, so much on the internet that I think sometimes people go, it's just too hard, too much, don't know what to do. Whereas, finding that individual response and what's right for you is good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so reading's one of your things that lights you up or is your self-care at the moment. Is there anything else that you do that you're like, it makes my heart sing?
Yeah, so look, being active, if either running or walking are my like more daily active things. My job is very sedentary. I'm sitting down talking to people, so this is one I have to be very mindful of because I need to be. I could go, see 7 clients in a day and not move. So being, physically moving my body is really important. We go, recreational bike riding, gravel riding with my husband. A lot of this, it's sort of his areas of interest and passion, probably one I wouldn't have done had I not met him. But, it's great. It's that shared time together. That's us having time together as a couple or as a family. Yeah. And, mountain biking in the summer, snowboarding in the winter, but we go out on the boat, on the lake. We go to the beach when we can. We don't live near a beach at the moment, but, all those things.
But I think come down and visit.
Yes, I will have to come down and visit. I think it's getting out, doing things either as a family or individually, even just going for a hike. I just love going for a hike when I have the time. We're a bit busy this year. I've got a lot on this year, so we're building a house that's going to keep me quite busy and getting ready for the Paris Olympics and travel over there. That's actually quite a lot of work in the lead up. So, this year will be quite busy, but I'm going to have to think about my self-care because I don't want to get there and be burnt out, for the 3 weeks that I'm over in Paris. So, absolutely something I have to think about too and focus on and work on.
That's exciting. And so this year you've got Paris coming up, which is that's going to be awesome. And have you been working with the Australian Olympic Institute for a while? In the lead up to Paris?
So I was appointed the lead psychologist sometime last year. I'm a bit of a blur now, I'm not really sure, probably midway through last year. And so there's a lot of organisation and preparation for those, weeks while I'm there. So making sure we're meeting with all the stakeholders, the national sporting organisations, and that we have a plan of best support for the athletes, particularly in the sports where there's not already a lead psychologist within the sport. But as I said, there's a lot of preparation that's going to go in between. Well, we're getting close now. So, be a busy time.
That's very exciting. And currently, like, what are your offerings at the moment? Like, are you still taking on clients? Like, who are you who are you seeing? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I'm quite busy. As I said, this year will be particularly busy. I work at the Victorian Institute of Sport. I work with, I've been with diving there for about 7 or 8 years. I've done cycling, various other sports, gymnastics and so on. So that's still a big part of my work. I work through the AIS, through the mental health referral network that I mentioned, and then have other sort of external contracts with the AFL and other areas. So they're the main areas. In terms of my private practice, I run a private practice in Melbourne. I still see clients there. I probably have limited capacity, but I have two wonderful psychologists that work with me there. I have Mark, who is a very, very experienced psychologist, was at the last Olympic Games, has worked in AFL and footy and VIS and many places. And then I have a new psychologist starting with me this year, actually, and she works in AFL and she's very motivated. So we've got plenty of capacity to see new people at the clinic.
That's awesome. Cool. And where can people find you?
Probably the best place is to jump on www.performanceedgepsychology.com. It's got all the details there, or on socials you can find us and get in touch that way, or drop us an email.
Cool. And I'll put all of it below so that everyone can find you with just a click of a button, which is awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks so much for coming on. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thanks, Heidi, so much for having me. You've asked some wonderful questions, and it's been really great discussion about all things that I'm pretty passionate about. So, I really appreciate having these kinds of conversations. The more people that we talk about with this stuff and hear, I think it's really important stuff. So, I'm grateful to you to put it out there in public domain.
You're welcome. I think my brain has gone, oh my gosh, my perspective has completely shifted just during this conversation, and I can only imagine that so many other people will be feeling the same way. And it's so cool that we can bring that to people on this platform as well. Hello. If you are watching this, it means you've made it to the end of the podcast, and I'm so blessed that you've chosen to spend the time here with us at Extremely Well. If you liked what you saw here today, and I'm hoping you did if you're here at the end, can you please hit that subscribe button, hit the follow, leave a review, tell us what you liked, what you didn't like. This is all for you. So we want to make sure that we are serving the community in the best way that we can. If you want to connect with us through our other channels, I'll leave them down below in the description box, and I can't wait to connect with you next time.